In a move that has had him branded a dictator by angry MPs, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson has suspended the British Parliament in an attempt to wrong-foot Labor, Lib Dem and Tory Remainers who, despite the will of the British people, wanted to stop Brexit. As we all know, the deadline for the UK departure from the EU is October 31st. The British Parliament had been expected to sit for the first 2 weeks of September before breaking up to allow each political party to hold their annual conference. But Parliament is expected to be suspended now from about September 10 until October 14, in a move designed to leave little time for further debate on Brexit ahead of that 31st of October deadline and cut the amount of time MPs have available to try and stop a no-deal Brexit. It's a story that's dominated world news today, but it's complex and tied up in a lot of parliamentary convention, meaning most commentators I've followed today have only got it about half right. So who better than a former presiding officer to wade through the detail and help us get across it all now? Joining me is former Speaker of the House of Representatives here and Sky News regular, Bronwyn Bishop. When I was casting around in my mind, Bronwyn, who could I get in to explain the intricacies here of proroguing and all the rules in relation to the Westminster system? Even though it's an Australian parliamentarian, you were and presiding officer, you know this stuff better than anyone. It is extraordinary what's happened overnight.
Well, I don't think it's extraordinary, Peter, because I said a couple of weeks ago on this very station that if I were Boris, I would be proroguing the Parliament because it is the only way he can guarantee that he can exit by the 31st of October. And in fact, if I were Boris, I would be proroguing the Parliament on the 3rd of September, the day the Parliament comes back, and I would be setting the date after the 31st of October, either the 1st or Monday the 5th, which heaven forbid is Guy Fawkes Day. But what it means is, when you prorogue, is you suspend the Parliament, the notice paper is cleared, and there can be no legislation passed to stop a no-deal Brexit occurring, and it gives him the opportunity then to bypass Article 50 altogether and start negotiating for a free trade agreement under the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. So what he's done, he's
I was just saying, it's interesting. Some have been calling it a coup. Some have said it's undemocratic. In fact, there's a woman, a lawyer in Britain, who's going to take a legal action. She's commenced legal action to say it's undemocratic. But of course, I'd have to say what's undemocratic is not abiding by the Brexit vote, which people made very clear.
Indeed. And in fact, the way the Parliament is prorogued, it is one of the few remaining royal prerogatives. It is when the Prime Minister goes to see the Queen and says to the Queen, will you please prorogue the Parliament because I want it to be suspended for this time. The Queen, by convention, always listens takes advice from her Prime Minister, and of course she conceded to his request. Now what happens is she will send her commissioners on the 10th of September to the House of Lords, where the pronouncement will be made. And the only part that the Speaker in the House of Commons plays in that is that they will process up to the House of Lords to listen to it being read out. But it will be then prorogued until the 14th of October. Now, Mr Bercow, whom I do know and is a very active Speaker, he has said he will vow with every breath in his body to stop the prorogation. So I wouldn't be giving, if I were Boris Johnson, I wouldn't be giving him from the 3rd to the 10th to try and get legislation through. I'd be chopping it off then and there, because a prorogation is not a, please don't come along and sit. It is the Queen's or the Sovereign's command to say when the Parliament will sit and when it can be prorogued. But it must have a date when the Parliament comes back, and that's when the Queen makes her speech about the new session. And there are good...
Yeah, and just so people understand that, I've got a copy of the Queen's statement. I'll put it up on the screen. You can see it at home. She issued a statement after her meeting, or the audience that she granted Boris Johnson, to be absolutely correct there. Interestingly too, the Queen gives a speech to the British Parliament every year in a way that isn't replicated in Australia. It only happens here after an election does the Governor-General give that speech. But you mentioned the Speaker, John Bercow. Now, he's been, you said he's an active speaker. I'd have to say worse than that. I think he's been an active participant for one side of the debate here. But how could he cause further grief to Boris Johnson here on this no Brexit?
Only by that small window of opportunity, by allowing, if they get the numbers, that is, Remainer Conservatives and the other odds and sods and Labor grabbing hold of the agenda. And as you know, only the government can set the business of the House. But if they get enough numbers together, they can grab control of that agenda, and John Bercow allowed that to happen on a previous occasion. But I think it's very important on the constitutional question and undemocratic to know there are lots of examples, and there are two very significant ones. One was in 1948, when the Attlee government was very concerned that the House of Lords would hold up its legislation to nationalise the iron and steel industry. And so they introduced, they prorogued the Parliament for a political purpose so that they could reduce the period of time that the House of Lords could hold up their legislation to allow it to get through in that term of Parliament. The second one, and it's interesting because of the criticism of John Major, he himself, for a political purpose, prorogued the Parliament, or asked the Sovereign to prorogue the Parliament, when, for the 1997 election, before the 1997 election, because the report had been brought down on cash for questions, which was a scandal under his administration, and he did not want that to be discussed and debated in the House. So he prorogued the Parliament 3 weeks in advance of the election date being established, and then embarked on a 6-week election campaign, which is very, very long for the UK. So all in all, a couple of months went by when there was no Parliament. Now, if Boris had in fact had prorogued on the 3rd and let the Parliament go back on the 1st, it's a similar period of time. So proroguing is not unusual.
We'll see what happens.
We'll see what happens.
I knew you'd be full bottle.
And also,
I knew you would be full bottle, Bronwyn Bishop.
Just for the record, we do prorogue for a session of Parliament for various reasons. When the Queen comes to visit, we prorogue the Parliament just so she can make a speech.